Good morning and evening and afternoon to everyone joining from around the world. I know people from a number of countries joining this meeting. So before we start the proceedings, I think a couple of housekeeping points. When we have the speeches, we will, it'll be good everyone can mute and even the videos, if you can switch off the videos as well once we start. And only the speakers will be unmuted, and also there'll be a presentation. I think we'll be sharing that, and it's we expect the event to be around an hour, 1 hour, maximum 1 hour 15. So depending on the number of questions we have. So however, the plan is to limit the whole event to 1 hour 15. So the agenda will be, for those who don't know me, I'm the president of the Association of Professional Sri Lankans in the UK. So I will be giving a brief introduction to APSL, followed by an introduction to the We Sri Lanka project by the project leader, Mr. Gihantha Jayasinghe. And then we'll have our keynote speaker, Mr. George Willy, giving his keynote speech. And followed by that, we'll have a Q&A session. We will, as we mentioned during the registration, we will give priority to people who sent the questions during registration. So Gihantha did receive a number of questions, which we will discuss first. And then if you have any other questions, please do send this via the chat button, which comes to the host. At the moment, I'm the host, but I'll be transferring the host to Gihantha after Mr. George Willy's speech. So yeah, do send the chats to the host, and then we will discuss those questions, provided that we have enough time. So as I said, I think we expect to finish the webinar by 4:15. Okay, with that, I will give a brief introduction to APSL. APSL, as a professional association, which was formed about 16 years ago, we have been supporting the Sri Lankan community, particularly reconciliation, over the past years through a number of events as well as projects. And we were formed in 2004 in the UK to support the communities, both communities in Sri Lankan communities in the UK as well as Sri Lanka. And we have been very active in both countries, supporting our members, and we have been delivering a number of highly successful relief programs and events. In the UK, we have been organizing a number of events. Sorry, just let me mute everyone because I can see some background noise. So in the UK, we have been actively organizing a number of events. I'll just briefly go through the events we have. So one of the key events is the Ask the Expert series and young professional events to showcase leading Sri Lankan professionals, either senior professionals or younger professionals. That has been going on for more than a decade now. We regularly organize that event. And then this particular project or the event, We Sri Lanka, to promote reconciliation. So it has been, again, we organized a number of events in UK, as well as we had a number of projects in Sri Lanka promoting reconciliation. And then the next event we organize is called Living in the UK series, and student engagement for Sri Lankan university students, APSL mentoring scheme for the young professionals as well as students, to give a platform for the particularly another event to mention there is a research symposium. We give a platform for the young researchers to present their research projects. So that was quite successful as well. We had that going on for a number of years, and we are planning to have another research symposium in collaboration with the Sri Lankan High Commission this year. And in Sri Lanka, we continue to deliver our relief and sustainable development programs. To name a few, scholarship scheme, one of the successful programs. And then we have student essentials, solar villages for sustainable development, and emergency relief fund. Particularly, we were very active during last year when the Sri Lanka was affected by COVID. We supported a large number of families, and as well as that particular relief program supports people affected by natural disasters. And also we have cancer relief program and chronic kidney disease relief program as well. And 2019-20 was a highly productive year for APSL. We continue to grow our initiatives both in this country as well as in Sri Lanka, even though with all these logistical difficulties. Particularly the scholarship scheme, we marked the fifth anniversary in 2019, and we are currently supporting over 100 children around the country from grade 4 to A levels. And one of the other major initiatives we launched last year was the Florence De Silva Fund for Children. We got kind donation from Mrs. Florence De Silva's will to support the Sri Lankan children. Through that, so far we supported 23 projects and over 2 million rupees. So that has been really good progress over the past year and a half. And also we've made significant progress with the APSL Solar Village project, and the third Solar Village project was opened by end of last year in Mullaitivu district, Puttiyanagar village, led by Gihantha Jayasinghe, We Sri Lanka project leader. So we also expanded the cancer relief program, which is again around the country. We established a number of new centers to support cancer patients in Sri Lanka. And when the COVID pandemic, as I said, affecting Sri Lanka, we explored numerous ways to support Sri Lankans. One of the ways we did was providing direct financial support by providing dry rations to Sri Lankans. Through that, we raised significant amount of funds, and we supported over 1,600 families in Sri Lanka, again around the country. And also we provided PPE to 9 hospitals around the country again. And also in UK, we launched a webinar series to support Sri Lankans by providing guidance and information. So we had webinars on topics such as employment, immigration, economy, mindfulness, as well as COVID-19 tests, treatments, and vaccines. So again, these were delivered by leading professionals in their respective fields, majority of them are Sri Lankans. We also delivered a webinar recently in collaboration with the Sri Lanka High Commission to promote the Sri Lankan IT industry. So that was very highly well received, as well as a number of people around the world joined that event as well. So this is a very brief introduction to APSL, and I hope you all will enjoy this particular presentation, and quite a timely presentation. With that, I would like to hand over to Mr. Gihantha Jayasinghe, our We Sri Lanka project leader.
Thank you, Mahesh. Aibowan, Vanakkam, Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all fellow Sri Lankans and friends of Sri Lanka joining from across the world, including the US, here in the UK, UAE, Sri Lanka, and elsewhere. Before we get on to the much awaited talk from our eminent speaker, George Willy, I will briefly describe the We Sri Lanka initiative launched by APSL. So We Sri Lanka is aimed at supporting a peaceful, united, and prosperous Sri Lanka. Next page. So following the brutal 30-year conflict, people are now, or have been, looking forward to peace, stability, and prosperity in Sri Lanka. But of course, absence of violence does not guarantee peace, and there is still some mistrust and division between the communities. A long-lasting peace needs the overcoming of historic prejudices, barriers, and the coming together of the hearts and minds of all Sri Lankans. and of course, definitely supported by economic prosperity. So APSL launched the We Sri Lanka initiative in 2010. We celebrated 10 years last year. And as I mentioned earlier, our key aims are to promote peaceful coexistence and sustainable development in Sri Lanka. We go about this through three ways: reconnecting, rebuilding, and reconciling. Reconnecting. So at the end of the conflict in 2009, APSL ran events across 3 years in 2010, 11, and 12 to encourage the different communities, the Sri Lankan communities living in the UK, to reconnect with each other. We celebrated our rich and diverse cultural traditions. We enjoyed the wonderful multi-ethnic cuisine, but most importantly, listened to talks and different panel discussions and participated in conversations across the ethnic divide about the issues at hand, but also most importantly about the ways to move forward. Rebuilding. Through these events and also our annual APSL dinner dances, we raised funds to contribute to the post-conflict rebuilding effort in Sri Lanka. This was mainly to uplift children and women affected by the conflict in conflict areas through educational scholarships, financial assistance, and IT equipment. We also pledged to extend our Solar Village program to a disadvantaged village in the Vanni. And I'm very happy to say, as Mahesh mentioned earlier, we completed that project at the end of last year, and it is now generating renewable solar energy for the national grid from this village called Puthianagar near Mankulam. And from the additional income that will come to the village, we will see the economic upliftment of the displaced families that were resettled there after the conflict. Moving on to reconciling. This is the third pillar of our activity. And this is, of course, overcoming or helping to overcome the historic prejudices that divide us, build stronger understanding and trust, and working towards a more durable peace. At the events, we listen to talks from the Northern Ireland Office, the Sri Lanka High Commission, and the Commonwealth Secretariat about peace building, about economic cooperation, and also importantly, developing a more inclusive and plural society in Sri Lanka. We listen to the activists from the Sinhala, Tamil, Muslim, and Burgher communities living in the UK, and very importantly, the young people from second generation British Sri Lankan families on their ideas, their perspectives, and the work that we have to do to bring about reconciliation. So this brings us to the webinar series. We are in a pandemic situation. We cannot have face-to-face interaction, as in live, in physically. So we are kicking off this new webinar series, again, with the aims of fostering peaceful coexistence and sustainable development. And that brings me to our inaugural webinar, which we are so proud to feature George Willy on the theme, An Anatomy of a Sri Lankan Reconciliation. George is an eminent US lawyer who has served as an advisor and has advised the Clinton and Obama administrations on immigration law and South Asia and South Asians living in the US. He hosts a TV show, The Other Side, where he interviews prominent public figures, and also the Minds That Matter radio show that features people with extraordinary abilities in various fields of endeavor. Most of us came to know of George when he gave a highly acclaimed speech on reconciliation during the visit to Texas by President Mahinda Rajapaksa after the end of the war. So now it gives me great pleasure to invite George Willy to talk to us about his thoughts and ideas about achieving a long-lasting reconciliation in Sri Lanka. Over to you, George.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to inaugurate your APSL We Sri Lanka webinar series. I'm sure you'll be hearing from far more prominent speakers in your future webinars, but I'm certainly honored to be speaking to you today. Don Jayasinghe, a member of your executive committee who just introduced me, initiated this invitation, and I noticed how English he had become. He was polite and yet firm, respectful, yet careful of giving ground. All this with a fine English accent, as you just heard him. I have learned that this group is made up of high achievers, even as high as a knighthood. And I think I saw the knight. I suppose I will have to mind my P's and Q's. I chose to speak to you today on reconciliation. Thus, I style my speech an anatomy of Sri Lankan reconciliation. That APSL would make its inaugural address for this webinar series a conversation on reconciliation speaks not only of its deep commitment to Sri Lankan progress, but also to the urgency of a reconciliation. I want to register my deep appreciation for APSL's search for peace and for keeping this issue alive. The moment one steps up to talk about reconciliation, he's hoisted on two ropes and hung over a pit of fire. Pulling either rope too hard could drop him into this pit, which means I must be careful how I frame the issue. Yet, I cannot allow the fear of being barbecued to render a meaningless, insipid speech. So wish me luck as I begin my tightrope walk over River Thames with only the pole of reason to aid me. Hegel, the German philosopher of history, famously said, quote, "We learn from history that we do not learn from history," end quote. History is also a treacherous teacher, especially when her lessons are based on stories far back in time and often unverifiable. We have more urgent matters to deal with. In the most recent survey of Sri Lanka, the World Bank said, quote, "A development success story in many ways. Sri Lanka still faces critical challenges as it strives to become an upper middle income country. The World Bank Group supports Sri Lanka's transition to a more competitive, inclusive, and resilient upper middle income country," end quote. Our focus, therefore, must be on the here and now and not on the past. We can change the lives of the living, and therefore our efforts are better spent on them. Sri Lanka is attempting to rise, as we heard before, from a lower middle income country to an upper middle income country. COVID-19 has disrupted this ascent as it has of the entire globe. Sri Lanka will need a lot of assistance and a lot of help. Organizations such as APSL can and want to help. The resources such organizations can marshal and deliver are substantial. Sri Lankan expatriates around the world have always wanted to share with their motherland what they have acquired abroad. Besides, many of us have political access to our new host countries. When our own resources are bundled with resources available in these countries as aid or investments, they can become formidable sources of assistance. More importantly, we can direct these resources in ways that can advance social goals. One such goal can be reconciliation. Each project, each venture, each program must have a reconciliation component. APSL and other similar organizations, such as Propel Lanka here in Houston, led by Dr. Bandula Vijay, should form a robust, well-informed, and a passionate group or group that can assist, perhaps called the Reconciliation Committee. Every project planned or initiated by these groups on their own or in collaboration with the others or governments must be reviewed by this committee to identify reconciliation opportunities. If there are such opportunities, the project must include these recommendations as conditions precedent to funding. Let me give you some examples of what some of these reconciliation opportunities might be. An engineering project, for instance, will get priority if there are partners from each of the ethnic communities undertaking the project in Sri Lanka. Agricultural projects will be rewarded if there is a north-south collaboration. Projects that have rehabilitation component directed at helping people that have suffered mental or physical injury during the war will be given priority. In general, those efforts that can encourage collaboration between the various ethnic groups will be favored and funded. A dedicated and focused group must design these opportunities. Such an effort can be global. Further, I believe the Sri Lankan leadership probably will welcome this effort because it veers away from politics and rests solely on economics. Some of you may be disappointed that I did not propose a political solution. Final road to reconciliation will have to be political. However, it is the most difficult. The moment the issue of reconciliation is raised, the political fabric of the country begins to get torn in several pieces. Those in power then must deal with competing interests and competing passions. When the economy is weak and political power fragile, it is difficult for the leadership to drag the splintered voices to the table. I'm certain President Gotabaya and his brother, Prime Minister Mahinda, want a lasting reconciliation. I had spoken to both some years ago. They were quite eager to get to the table. Between where they are and the table, there is a deep and wide moat full of crocodiles. What I propose begins to lay some vital economic bridges over the moat, which can eventually lead to a political solution. Once collaboration and cooperation become the norm and economic benefits begin to flow to all of the competing interests, the groundwork will be laid for a political solution. There are some examples in history which are recent and verifiable. The Marshall Plan in Japan and Germany turned two sworn enemies of the United States into staunch allies. All it took was a bold reconstruction plan, purely economic. Even the American society mended after the Civil War when the North invested heavily in the South. Economic collaboration makes ethnic and tribal differences insignificant for two reasons. One, both sides gain in the project. Two, it creates dependency among the collaborators. If they were to build a bridge over a river, the calculations of one engineer will be relied upon by the engineer who lays the beam across the water. An error by any one of them can be disastrous. So they have to rely on each other. When we create vested economic interest in multiple projects, those who have economic interest in them will silence the extreme voices. The silencing of the extreme voices will allow the political leadership to find a more permanent solution. I have a wife and two daughters, all three of them extremely bright. Watching them over the last few years, I've been driven to near despair, wondering about why men excluded women from vital decision-making activities or from education and development. We excluded roughly 1/2 of our society from critical contributions. From the beginning of our species nearly 3 million years ago, I guess we excluded billions of members of our society from contributing to our progress. This, I believe, is historically the costliest mistake we have made. Just imagine if we had allowed this half of humanity to contribute to our progress. If with only half of the human effort we have achieved so much, just imagine what we may have achieved if the other half had been allowed to participate. I think we may have already reached the stars and achieved what we dream about in science fiction. Similarly, excluding a group of humans from vital activities of a society only makes us crippled in what we do. Embracing them, on the other hand, enriches us. We also need to shed our ethnic chauvinism. We have succumbed to a pernicious practice of downgrading the other ethnic group. There is a deeply felt superiority over the other group. Often such superiority is based on nothing more than myths handed down by the older generation to the new without any evidence of such claim. They may be handed down either through spurious arguments or more often by funny lines. We need to begin to appreciate the contributions of all ethnic groups in Sri Lanka. I'm a proud Tamil from Jaffna. I grew up in awe of the Tamil language, Tamil poetry, and the reach and depth of its expression were mesmerizing. We were told that the Chola kings conquered the Far East and the mathematical genius of the Tamil people. I remain enthralled by these triumphs of the Tamil culture. However, achievements of one culture should not lead to the blindness of the other. The Tamils must pay Sinhalese culture the respect it deserves. Singlish language is old, ranks among one of the oldest languages. It grew in parallel to and often interacted with Pali, one of the oldest and rich languages in history, perhaps in par with Sanskrit. They can claim some of the most astounding engineering feats found in the Polonnaruwa, Anuradhapura, and other areas in Sri Lanka. I still get goosebumps when I climb the Sigiriya, although I'm not sure if I still can. The stone rug in one of Polonnaruwa ruins was redone to rid it of cows out of respect to the king's Hindu bride. The Sinhalese must also learn, study, and appreciate Tamil contributions. Having lived together in the same island For thousands of years, we know so little of others' language, aspirations, and struggles. How many Sinhalese can name one of the most iconic and loved female Tamil poets of antiquity? How many Tamils can name the Sinhalese author of a Sanskrit version of the Ramayana written in the 6th century? If ethnic chauvinism blinds us to obvious greatness of the other group, we are bound to fail. By allowing ethnic chauvinism to blind us to each other's greatness, we are devaluing our own. The Sigiriya is our architecture, not merely a Sinhalese monument. The Nallur Kovil is our Kovil, not merely a Tamil Kovil. Learning each other's language will go a long way in bridging this gaping hole. As I said before, when we exclude a significant part of a society, we become victims. Here in the US, we recently learned the lesson one more time. One group claiming superiority over the others can be exploited even to the point of threatening the most admired democracy. Efforts to translate major works of Tamil and Sinhalese into each other's language will be a good start. A commission should be set up with great fanfare and funded by sources that have no political interest. There have been sporadic efforts leading to some translations, but they have not been consistent or significant. The most recent translations occurred in 2015 under the auspices of the Sri Lankan government. I believe a grand effort to translate both ways, books of significance, if handled right, can encourage reconciliation, which can become infectious. Without a comprehensive reconciliation program, Sri Lanka will be weighed down by ethnic tensions, and they will hold back its progress. And if ignored, we could plunge into mayhem again. Your Queen recognized a few Sri Lankans on the New Year honorees list. Dr. Shikandini Kanagasundaram, Professor Ravi Silva, Professor Mohan Edirisinghe, Professor Ramani Munasinghe, Gajan Wallupullai, Mohammed Hasrat Halim Osman. If we celebrated only the Sinhalese among them, we will only have 3 names to celebrate. Tamils, only 2. Muslim, 1. However, if we celebrated the achievements of Sri Lankans, we get to celebrate 6. Which do we choose? Let me end my remarks with a personal story. Those who are old enough to will remember the 1958 riots. Mobs ran amok in Colombo, burning and destroying lives and property of Tamils. I was an 8-year-old living in Jaffna. My father was a senior official in the prison department. Jaffna prison was placed inside Jaffna Fort. We had a bungalow inside the fort, a few yards from the prison. There was panic among the few Sinhalese families living in Jaffna at the time. Many of them were friends of our family. I'm not sure how the logistics worked out, but 8 Sinhalese families moved into our home for protection. Tents were erected in the front and back of our house, and the men slept outside and the women slept inside the house. My parents spared no pain to protect these families. Among the families was an optometrist named Patirana, who was the brother of the later Chief Justice of Sri Lanka under Sri Mao, and the government agent of Jaffna, Manigatunga, and his wife joined us too. I'm sure there were Sinhalese families in Colombo that offered shelter to Tamil families. The friendships that were formed among Tamils, Sinhalese, and Muslims were lifelong. We ate in one another's kitchens. In fact, my mom could cook some Sinhalese dishes with the best of them. We can turn Sri Lanka into a Singapore much faster if all the ethnic groups in Sri Lanka put their collective shoulder to the wheel. We are all brothers and sisters. We just got lost on the dark side of our own prejudices. Let's find ourselves again. Let's return hand in hand to paradise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you very much for that most inspiring talk, but also a talk with lots of tangible ways on how we can work together to bring about lasting reconciliation in Sri Lanka. Broadly speaking, I believe you addressed two main areas. One was about linking reconciliation to economic development, including how professional organizations like APSL, for instance, can collaborate with other similar organizations to identify reconciliation opportunities and include these opportunities in their projects. You also very importantly spoke about the importance of laying economic bridges, because a political solution may be difficult to get to right away, about laying economic bridges to build confidence, creating mutual benefit and interdependence before getting to a political solution. So that was a key area of focus. The other area, crucially, was about shedding ethnic chauvinism and really appreciating the heritage and contribution of all the ethnic groups in Sri Lanka, not downgrading the other ethnic group or feeling superior, but really appreciating the contribution and heritage of the different ethnic groups, and very importantly, learning each other's language. Then, of course, you also mentioned the importance of translating major Tamil and Sinhala literary works into each other's language. So I think I've tried to capture the different aspects of what you mentioned in terms of the economic development linked to reconciliation, and also the importance of appreciating each other and shedding the ethnic chauvinism. Now, what I would like to do is to take questions from today's audience, but also questions that have come through prior to this. And I will start with the questions that came to us earlier. And we may not be able to get through all of them, but we'll do our best. So first question to you, George, is what is the role of the diaspora in the reconciliation process?
Yeah, I think it's going to be vital, the functions, the role that the diaspora can play. As I pointed out, many of us are in positions to be able to at least influence some of the projects that are being undertaken by countries where we ended up in. And then from there, we can look at these projects, and each project that is then finally headed that way should be reviewed by a reconciliation committee, whereas the committee can be just a locally based one or globally set up one that can look to see what opportunities, as you pointed out in your summary, and on how we can develop those opportunities into opportunities for reconciliation. So I think diaspora can play a vital role in helping this partly because, the diaspora generally tend to be, better economically situated, and therefore they could do this. And more importantly, Don, the diaspora has always had this urge to go back and help Sri Lanka. It's a very deep feeling, a very profound feeling of wanting to go back and help. I think the moment we step into a foreign country, we're already thinking about doing something in Sri Lanka. So I think we should sort of, exploit that feeling of the diaspora to go back and help. So.
Okay, thank you, George. And I guess this question is linked to that. So the question says, is linking economic prosperity actually through reconciliation possible in today's context, or in the current grand scheme of things, is that actually possible? Are we not sort of sleepwalking into a situation that is not achievable? So the question is really sort of saying, your argument about linking the economics to a political solution and reconciliation, is that possible in the current context?
I'm not sure why he or she would think that it's sleepwalking, but the issue is the kind of linking economics to reconciliation is much easier actually than doing the grand schemes of the type of things that we think about all the time. But I think the micro adjustments to some of these economic projects are probably, if you think about it, if it grows and you have several projects that are linked to reconciliation, then you're going to find out that people, when they have been vested in economic interests, right, then they try to protect that. And if the two ethnic groups are working on the same economic project, then that's a tendency to protect that project. And if there are extreme voices that are trying to disrupt that, then they are going to defend their territory. They are going to defend their turf. And that if each economic project begins and those who participate are beginning to defend the turf, then you're going to find out there are going to be a lot of defense against extremism. Oh. That's the point. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, I think, yes, the current context is challenging, but I think that is again because of the lack of trust and confidence. And what you have said about giving vested interest, about creating mutual benefit, creating interdependence, that will create a great platform to sort out some of the thorny issues. Thank you, George. The next question is an interesting one. So the question is about, I guess, what the minority communities are doing currently, and there might be certain aspects of the minority communities, but the question goes, so the minority communities are lobbying and campaigning against Sri Lanka at international forums, rather than taking a more sort of positive approach to bring about reconciliation. Would or should minority communities take a more proactive and work towards a meaningful reconciliation rather than taking a hostile approach?
So, the problem with that is there are those whose passions are high because maybe they were witness to some horrible thing in their lives, or they were affected, their families are affected, whatever that might be. And so you cannot ignore that. However, I think what we can do is ask them to join the types of efforts that I'm talking about. Okay, you can continue to do what you were doing if you wanted to, but join us also, and let's try this economic model, and see whether you can help us there. and maybe transfer that passion to what we are trying to do, and convince them that, hey, listen, there is another way. I think, as I said, we should be focusing on the living,
Sure.
and there's enough to be done for the living. So let's focus on that, and let's ask them to join us. And then, yeah.
And George, that's interesting because it kind of some of the, relates to some of the discussions we've had before about, yes, there is voices of extremes or voices of extremism on both sides. And sometimes what we have to do through work like what you're talking about, through this webinar, for instance, giving voice to the voices of moderation and coming together and making that louder, so that there are opportunities, there are areas where people can collaborate and come together to work towards reconciliation. There's another interesting question. I think this also goes very close to what you've mentioned before, and it's the role of religion. And the question asks, what is the role of religious leaders in bringing about reconciliation in Sri Lanka?
I'm really glad that somebody asked that question, because I didn't mention that. I didn't address that in my speech. I think the religious participation is going to be very critical, because I think the clergy of all religions will have to come together, and they have very strong voices in Sri Lanka. And especially the Buddhist clergy. And then we saw from time to time, Buddhist clergy making an enormous contribution to peace. There are people in the clergy that are really well-meaning and wanting to help. So I think we need to give voice to those people and encourage them to help. And as we all know, religion has played a big role in Sri Lanka, no matter what the religion is, and we are kind of religious folks down there, and they have a pulpit, and they can use it, and they do use it, and I think we should encourage them to use it for better purposes than what they do sometimes.
Thank you, George. The next question. What should authorities do through regional bodies? And when we talk about regional bodies here, we're referring to district committees, rural councils that have been created recently. So what should authorities do through regional bodies to attract investment from overseas Sri Lankans to implement creative projects to improve the living standards of people in the areas, the war-affected areas, to bring about peaceful coexistence?
So that I thought that was an interesting question, because that just plays into exactly the model that I was proposing. That is, they can collaborate among themselves first, right? For instance, a regional council or regional committee, let's say in Jaffna, and one in Mathura, right? These folks can come together and say, listen, let's get together and ask for some funding from outside, all right, from APSL, for instance, all right. And so now APSL says, you know what, that's the kind of collaboration, and those are the kinds of projects we want to support. And therefore they then begin to help. Now already these regional committees and councils working among themselves can form these groups that we really want to encourage there, right? So I thought that would be an interesting way for us to do. Now, there could be an internal reconciliation committee in Sri Lanka that kind of acts as a sort of a clearinghouse for these committees and councils to come together and then go after funding. And so if they find that for going after funding in a sort of a cooperative way, it brings more funding than otherwise, then we'll encourage more and more of these folks to get together and come for funding.
Yes. So I think, in your talk, you talked about how professional associations and organizations internationally can bring about or can focus on trying to identify reconciliation opportunities and make sure they tap into those. But also what's interesting from what you've just said is that perhaps within Sri Lanka as well, there should be some mechanisms where, reconciliation opportunities are identified and implemented, as you just mentioned. The next question, George, is now we've talked about role of international organizations, professional organizations, government also, and but we know in a democracy, sometimes the government reflects the general or common position held or general views held by the people. So they're influenced by that. So what should ordinary Sri Lankans do to advance reconciliation? And this is a two-part question. And the second part is what can be done to persuade ordinary citizens to work towards reconciliation?
Yeah, I agree with you. And obviously we can't sacrifice democracy. But the ordinary Sri Lankans, I think they have to sort of look, what needs to be done is that instead of looking at Sri Lanka in black and white, in two modes, right? We should look to see, how these two or three or four ethnic groups coming together, so that we need to encourage the ordinary Sri Lankan to have opportunities. Somebody mentioned yesterday when we were having a chat on about bringing some of these religious festivals to celebrate them together. The Sinhala Tamil New Year, for instance.
Yes.
It's a great opportunity for us. We celebrate it on the same day, and yet we celebrate it from far places. Just let's get together. It's our New Year, right? So let's get together. Let's exchange food, as this guy was telling us yesterday. It would be wonderful. I enjoy both foods, so I'd love to join. So it'll be a wonderful way for us to begin, and then that also kind of subtly brings in the religions together too, right? So there are opportunities for the ordinary Sri Lankans, but somebody needs to initiate this. Somebody needs to get serious about this. Somebody needs to organize this. There's a lot of work to be done.
Yes.
But that's how we are going to have to do this. And the ordinary Sri Lankan is going to be critical in this, because it needs to be a grassroots effort.
Great. So this next question actually links up very nicely with what you said, because we need the right approach from citizen Sri Lanka, but they also need overall support. So this question says, are we seeing an initiative from the government to encourage reconciliation, and what specifically would you encourage from the government?
In the last regime, Vasudeva Nanayakkara was in charge of reconciliation, and I know him well, and it's a fine man, and then he had begun some initiatives, especially about teaching the languages to each other's kids, and in some of the other initiatives too. And he and I had chatted about this. So I don't know in this current government whether there has been any effort in that direction. I think they've been busy. They just recently elected, and then they had to deal with COVID-19. I think everything is in the back burner now for all of us, I think. But I would imagine that they would begin to do something. And what I would like to do is organizations like APSL begin to engage at the political level too. We begin to ask the High Commissioner, for instance, and say, listen, can we begin this conversation? Can we start something? Can we set up a reconciliation committee in UK, in the US? And then engage the political forces down there, the minister who may be in charge of this or whatever, and engage them. I think that's what we ought to do, and then maybe to some extent direct the policy, direct the thinking in the way that they're doing, because sometimes they're busy with a lot of stuff, immediate things, and somebody should go and give them the big picture, the long term stuff, right? And I think we could be the instruments for that.
Thank you. And this next question, George, is related, but the question says specifically, how can we encourage the politicians to be more supportive of the reconciliation process?
One of the ways to do a slower way is what I proposed. If economic projects are going to be tied to reconciliation, and the politicians are going to start paying attention to that, right? Money talks, right? So in that respect, I think that is one way to get their attention. And if for instance, say if UK is going to fund something in Sri Lanka, either through aid or some investments or whatever, and the reconciliation committee gets there and says, listen, we need to have a reconciliation component on this. That will then get the Sri Lankan government, the politicians, to start thinking about this. It's no longer purely an economic project. It has a reconciliation component.
Yeah.
And so that is something that is some way to start influencing political thinking.
Thank you, George. I think we have covered most of the questions. If there is any other question that anybody would like to pose at this point in time to George, please do so. We still have a little bit of time left, so if there is any other questions, kindly pose in the chat now. Okay, so there is a question here. I think, again, it's quite related to what we've talked about. And it does appreciate that, we've been advocating the economic position first. And this person sort of says he personally thinks that it's the politics that facilitate the economics. What would your response be to that?
Read Karl Marx. That could be poisonous, but the idea is, you remember what he said in all of his writings, including Das Kapital, that it is the economic relationship, the relationship to the means of production, is what produces the political thought. We think politics affects economics. Actually, it is the economics that affects politics, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore, if you start affecting the economics, politics will follow. Okay, it's not that clear cut. I'm not saying that it's that clear cut, but there is interaction between economics.
Absolutely,
and politics.
yes.
So it's not. I'm not trying to make the argument that it's just cast in stone, but generally you will notice that the political thinking is affected by the economics. Okay,
and it's what you said earlier very clearly, that you're not, some people might be disappointed that you're not necessarily suggesting a political approach. And it's not that you're discarding it. What you're saying is that we need an economic foundation as an enabler to grapple with the political framework to come later. So yes, absolutely.
That's right. Yes. And also, you don't have to go to Karl Marx to understand that. Even the other thinkers in economics and politics have been very clear about that it is, we have to affect the economic, because the reason for that is economics affects lives and the day-to-day living. And so if day-to-day living, you can't ignore that. And so once you start developing and once you start affecting it, then you will see political thinking change, and then that's what we are trying to do here, right? So you'll notice that in times of hardship, the political thinking changes. There is no what was thought to be and taken for granted suddenly becomes they start questioning it.
Sure.
So
also, a very interesting question has come through. Now, we know that China takes a big role in economic development in Sri Lanka. And the question is, do you think India can play a role in the economic development of Sri Lanka? Because obviously, India would also have links to both the ethnic groups from Sri Lanka.
Putting me between a rock and a hard place there. No, but I understand, right? Especially recently, there's been a raging debate about the Indian requests on the port and China and all of that. Obviously, Sri Lanka is, strategically placed in the Indian Ocean. And that's a very attractive place for both India and China. Now, honestly, I think we should play both, and take full advantage of that, and be able to resist any pressures to change our politics, right? But economic help, we take it any way it comes.
Sure.
Let them be, if they want to have their own, global politics, that's their problem. We'll take the money however it comes.
Sure. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, George. A question with a different flavor. So, what can expat organizations, or I guess when we say expat organizations, we mean professional organizations as well. What can expat organizations do to counter the negative news in Sri Lanka that divide the population?
That's a good question. We have to encourage the groups that are attempting to stop this divisional type of propaganda or extremist ideas that are being floated there, because as much as we hear the negatives, there are other people and organizations in Sri Lanka that are trying very hard to help tone down these voices, right? So I think we should hunt down these organizations in Sri Lanka that are working for moderation, working for reconciliation, and encourage their efforts. We can't directly go and fight the ones that are spreading the hate, but we most certainly can encourage those organizations and people that are going to help in moderating the thinking there.
Sure. Thank you. I think, yes, we have taken a number of questions, covered some broad areas, and I think we're approaching the end of the webinar. But an important question here, George, is, you talked about a lot of different ways to approach the process of reconciliation. What would you say is the single most important thing that needs to happen to make reconciliation work?
Well, ultimately, as I said, reconciliation is it's a political solution, right? No matter what everybody else does, it has to be political. And therefore, I think we need to seriously think about long-term ideas, of trying to bring all these groups together. What I always dreamed about was, what about bringing these different groups together in a grand event, in a great stadium, and then we say sorry to each other in this grand event, right? and then we embrace each other, and then we celebrate, and then we say, hey, we are Sri Lankans, right? We reaffirm our identities again, as you and I have spoken about the shared identity, right? And
Yes.
we sort of start a new beginning. We kind of bring all this together, and we bring it to the altar, and we put it on the altar and say, okay, we are all sinners. We have sinned, right? Now we ask for forgiveness, and we start anew. And in a symbolic effort like that is going to be a lot of things. It'll have all this coverage. It'll TVs will cover, the world will cover.
Sure. Yes.
And I've always dreamt about that. I don't know whether it'll ever happen, but it's just a nice thing to do.
Yes, and that links again. I mean, it links to another question that's just come up, but also it's how much do we look? And I think you mentioned this at the very beginning of your talk today, and not to sort of fall into the pit under you, which is how much do you learn from the past? How much do you take from the past? But also how much do you move forward without being crippled by the past? So, do you have any thoughts about that? Because people want to look at the past to sort of heal. And you talked about saying sorry to each other and moving forward, but yes, how future focused should we be, and what do we take from the past versus not?
Okay, now, although I said lessons of history are treacherous, that doesn't mean the past doesn't matter. As human beings, past matters. But you have to be careful what you pick. In the past, there are good things also. We need to start pulling some of the better things. We tend to pull, whatever supports our position at that time. So I think we need to look for good lessons that we've learned in the past. I always thought the Tugamanus, the monument for Elara was a fine gesture. And things like that. There are so many events like that along history that we can pick and then propagate those, right? I mean, so the past is important just to understand the present. Where are we now? And then we need to let go of the past and then work on the present and the future.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much. So I think we're 12 minutes past the hour, and we've had a very absorbing session with George Willy, who has spoken to you on a range of topics, from, as I mentioned earlier, linking economic development to reconciliation, and laying the foundation, laying the economic bridges, building the confidence, building the interrelationships and the mutual gain, so that the thorny issues of politics can be sorted out, and giving momentum to reconciliation. But also he spoke about very clearly the importance of really recognizing, appreciating each other, the value of the different contributions from the different ethnic communities in Sri Lanka, and learning to appreciate each other so that chauvinism can be abandoned, and we can move forward together as a single country, as with a common purpose, and an inclusive identity. So I would like to again thank you, George, for giving us your time. You're an extremely busy person. You've given us your time and your wonderful ideas and energy to encourage reconciliation in Sri Lanka. And seriously, there are lots of thoughts that we as an organization can take from this talk today, and help us to maybe reach out to other organizations, other similar-minded organizations, to develop the principles of what those reconciliation opportunities can be. So thank you very much, George. I want to also thank the audience that have joined today. You've taken time out from your Saturday afternoon, morning, and evening. I know it's a global audience, so thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. And continue to stay in touch. We will have future webinars as well, focused either on reconciliation or sustainable development. You can also write to We Sri Lanka at apsl.org.uk to support our projects and to be associated with work we do. I close by saying now in the United States, we have the first woman vice president. And I'm very happy to say that at APSL UK, we now have our first woman general secretary. And back to your comment as well, George, about how important it is to have both men and women working together going forward. So I take this opportunity now to invite Gaini, our General Secretary, to present the vote of thanks and close this webinar.
Thank you very much, Gihantha, for the nice compliment. On behalf of APSL, I would like to thank Mr. George Willy for a very inspiring talk with valuable thoughts and insights to reconciliation process. Huge thank you to APSL We Sri Lanka's timely webinar, a success with their dedication and efforts. Thank you to APSL Executive Committee for their help in various ways to make this event success. I also wish to extend my special thanks to all of you who joined today from different parts of the world, some of you representing various associations, and we very much hope to see you in our next webinar. So I'm not going to go for long. Enjoy your rest of the day, depending on the time where you are. And thank you very much.